Portuguese. Their history is very difficult to understand because by the 1500s, the Portuguese had landed by the coast. Now, Zayla was a trade partner with the people of Malawi, Mozambique, and all the areas down south. But this place, too, was in jeopardy when the Portuguese came. The first area to be attacked by the Portuguese was Kilwa, and there are even books bragging about the Portuguese coming in and bombarding the Kilwan civilization and destroying a wall, which today people don't even know about, that was surrounding the Kilwan areas. This wall, they brag, came down so easily. The man responsible for this evil act was Francisco de Almada. This man would eventually go and conquer some areas in Africa, but his history starts with kicking out other Africans from Europe, as he was in the raid or the siege of Granada, and then he made his way to the Kingdom of Congo, and past that, he made his way to South Africa, where he unsuccessfully fought against the Khoisan. Leaving some of his men behind, he had a mission to get to India, and en route to India, he decided to make his way to Mozambique and then Kilwa. He realized that Kilwa would be a great place to jump off ships going to India. And so what he did was he tried to raid and take over Kilwa, and he successfully did that. A lot of the people of Kilwa ran away into the mainland of Africa. Knowing the language and the people, they made their way to places like Malawi and Kenya. This led to the successful understanding of the Indian Ocean, and of course, one trade partner that became in trouble because of this was Zayla. Now, Zayla, as an area, had always been a trade partner with people as far as Great Zimbabwe and Mombasa. But the Portuguese did not discover it that early, and when they did, they described the people living in that area as, for the most part, jet black. Kilwa, that was one of the shortest routes to India, being taken over was not a good thing, but at least Zayla was not taken over. Another thing that happened was that there were wars that occurred in Congo in the central areas, not necessarily in the Kingdom of Congo. And as you can see, the sort of diaphanous clothing of blue and white stripes that was worn by the people of Congo influenced what would happen in Malawi, and also because they were trade partners in Zayla, some of the clothing in Ethiopia would eventually look like the clothing made by the people of Congo. So what happened? Well, because of constant war by the Kingdom of Congo, the Nziku, and so many other kingdoms, a group of people migrated as soon as the Portuguese got to Kilwa, and they arrived in Malawi at about the same time. And so, because of the Portuguese, you see several people from different locations around the world coming together in one location, forming one of the most formidable empires to ever exist. But there was still a problem. While the Portuguese were still more concerned with the coast, they were starting to learn more and more about the inside of Africa. And the Portuguese, now Viceroy of India, Francisco de Almada, was returning victorious after setting up forts in India. And on his way back, he would get a terrible surprise. The fact that he had underestimated the people of Africa came back to bite him. The people, the Khoisan, who were situated close to the Portuguese areas, were raiding cattle and attacking the Portuguese constantly. This made him furious and want to raid against them. And what could possibly go wrong? This man had fought against the Moors and won, fought against the Khoisan before and won, fought against the Kilwins and won, fought against the Indians and won. Obviously, it must be known that he would have won and taken over. So he sent an army of men against the Khoisan to destroy them so that they would never raid again. Unfortunately for him, he had underestimated these people, and they ended up killing not only him, but his entire army. And that was the end of his growing throughout Africa. After him, Albuquerque would be given the position that he had. This was not really good news in any way, shape, or form, as Alfonso de Albuquerque would be a greater explorer, a greater viceroy of India, and even more ready to take over other places in Africa, such as Zayla. But Zayla was not a sitting duck. It was connected to the greater lands of Abyssinia. And on top of that, the Turks and Egyptians had taken favor with it. And so there were defenses in islands around the Horn of Africa. And they found it difficult, the Portuguese, to actually enter these areas, which is why they came directly to Zayla. Now, of course, there was a leader in Zayla, and his name, which was a Abyssinian translation of the word Muhammad, was Mahfud. Mahfud, or Muhammad, had himself been a conqueror, and he took over several Christian lands and expanded them in his territory. Ethnically, he is described as belonging to the Harar or the Harari people of Somalia. And of course, this means that he was attacking people who looked like him. He was very devastating as a human being, as he would capture some Abyssinians who were not of the same kingdom as his, and he would take them as far as Arabia and India for slavery. And now the Portuguese were coming up against a kingdom like that was situated on the coast of the Horn of Africa, staring straight at them, ready to pounce. But when they heard of this, two things had happened. One, this king had already died, and two, the Indian route had been cut off by the Portuguese. They were starting to create a lot of enemies around the world. The Arabs, not happy about what is happening, decided to attack India, where the Portuguese were situated. Thanks to the Egyptians attacking, it made it impossible for the Portuguese to completely block off the trade of both the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. This meant that the people located in the Horn of Africa had a constant and a tie to Egyptian Arabs, and also they had a tie to Bantu people and would be able to summon them to war against the Portuguese. They did not do this to their detriment. But things would not be sweet forever, as we read. In 1517, the Portuguese governor of India, Lopo Saurus de Albergaria, sailed a large armada to attack Ottoman position in the Red Sea. Having failed to capture Jeddah, short on water and supplies, the fleet withdrew, having called at Kamaran Island before sailing to Zayla. At the time of the Sultanate of Adil was involving with most of his forces in a war in Ethiopia. A Portuguese ally and the emir of Zayla, Mufaz, had recently been killed. Having been warned that the Portuguese fleet was incoming, the inhabitants evacuated all women and children, and a number of warriors remained behind to defend the city and their ships left behind. They gathered on the beaches to the rest of the Portuguese landing. Seeing this, Albugaria determined to capture the city and landed a contingent of men. The Portuguese wrote that the city is of good size and flat by the edge of the sea. It's made of stone and lime houses with terraced roofs like those in Aden. Its inhabitants are Moors and merchants of great trade, and for the most part are black, men as well as children, and some white, and they treat each other well. Harassed by cannon fire and taunted, the Portuguese, under the command of Gaspar de Silva, Aires de Silva, and Antonio Ferreira, Fogaça, moved in to assault the city before the governor had landed, and when they realized there were few defenders, they occupied it after a brief struggle. A Portuguese prisoner, which had been held captive in Zela for 9 years, was rescued. The city was then torched and destroyed. And yes, I do know how to read the word held, but clearly over here they wrote help, which is a mistake they should fix. Now, obviously, there's something to explain here. See, by 1513, it became pretty obvious that the Portuguese could not take over this land. And so in 1513, they decided that they're going to send a fleet to go see what it's like over there. 40 ships were burned by the citizens of this region, Zala, and Adel and all the other areas had suddenly perked up and realized that there was a greater enemy that was coming. Within 5 years, 1518, the Portuguese had returned, but this time bigger and stronger. Now, this takeover you might look at as the beginning of the end, but actually it was the beginning of the beginning, because the Portuguese would have to continually fight wars against the Ethiopians and the Somalians in this region. It would not help that the Ottomans would be on the side of the Horn of Africa. But not only that, there was a growing threat. The people located in the Kingdom of Congo were starting to intermingle with the other Bantu people that were in Mozambique, Malawi, Kenya, Tanzania. This area was starting to become more and more crowded, and more civilizations were starting to emerge. But the Portuguese were not really aware of this. In their head, it was maybe some growth of population. They had no idea that the people inside of Africa was starting to affect the people on the coast. With back and forths between the Somalian cities which were around fighting back against the Portuguese, they decided that they needed to take another city. And so by 1528, they took over Berbera, a very historic city, one that was even mentioned by Ibn Battuta years ago. This is the image of a takeover of Somalia and Ethiopia. But this picture does not represent the size of takeover that the Portuguese had taken. Instead, it represents the Sultanate of Adel and how big they expanded. Because by the 1540s, Adel had pushed away the Portuguese. This would not be an easy task, because at first the Portuguese were winning. Adel, deserves its own video, was fighting and winning territories around Ethiopia and then growing and eventually made its way to the Portuguese. Unfortunately, the Portuguese were heavily armed and were ready to fight against these people. And there was a crushing defeat that was sort of embarrassing for the Sultanate. But old enemies are old enemies indeed. as the Sultanate of Adil decided to use his Islamic connections, calling for the Arabs and the Ottomans to send troops to Africa to help defeat the Portuguese, in which they did. The Portuguese at this point stood no chance, as the Ottomans and the Arabs kept sending more and more troops, and the Portuguese basically had about 2 ships left when they decided to retreat. And of course, Adil became the conquerors of this land, bringing back the stability of this region and also the understanding that the religion that would be in charge of this region for a very long time would be Islam. Though raidings against Christians continued, the Ethiopians would hold fast, both being Beta Israel and being Christian within Ethiopia. These walls that still stand today were erected in the 1500s, and they were built as a fortress in order to stop any real attack from enemies. And you can see the fact that they're still intact means that they played a very significant role in wars going forward. Islam had always drawn the regions where Islam was together, but suddenly it became obvious to the Ottomans that this world war that was happening at the moment was not a matter of which kingdom versus what kingdom, but instead it was a war for religion. And so Suleiman the Magnificent decided to send letters and communicate with people as far as the Swahili coast, who they had always had some light communication with. And he said that they need to choose between the Portuguese and the Ottomans. And since they are Muslim, there really is no choice. And so the Swahili were reinforced by the Ottomans, and the Ottomans were reinforced by the Swahili. Suddenly, from Somalia all the way to Mozambique, there was a great force that was ready to attack the Portuguese at any moment. All Portuguese holdings in this area, the little pockets that they had, were in trouble. For this next part, I recommend watching my video about the coastal cities that were located around the Swahili coast and, of course, the Horn of Africa. The important thing here is that these lands are the lands that were now controlled by the Portuguese, but the Ottomans were ready. Mozambique Island, which was once colonized by the black Muslims and aided by the Persians. Sofala, which was a great partner of the Muslim Greater Lands. Mombasa, which was a far trading region for both East Africa and the Arabs. Malindi, Kilwa, and Pemba. Now remember this, these lands once belonged to the black Africans. And now these black Africans had appealed to the Ottomans under Suleiman, and one by one they would be recaptured from the Portuguese. But it wouldn't be that easy for the Muslims, as the Christians located in Ethiopia, who are fighting constantly with the Muslims, had something to say about this. And of course, because they had spies and communication with the people in the Portuguese regions, they summoned the Portuguese, and the Portuguese went to Mogadishu and attacked the city with the help of the Ethiopian. And also because of the capture of some of these Swahili states, the Portuguese had converted some Swahili men into Christianity, and again, working as spies, smuggling Portuguese people, disguising them as if they were Ottomans themselves, they were able to infiltrate certain regions. The first steps that show us that this is a world war is the entrance of Christopher da Gama, the son of the explorer Vasco da Gama. Christopher da Gama was sent from India by the Portuguese to help aid against Menas, the father of Sarsadengo, the person who they were trying to establish as the king of Ethiopia was a man named Tazkaro. Bar Nagesh Yashek, who was a wannabe kingmaker, tried to establish Tazkara as the king of Ethiopia, but failed as Tazkara was captured and thrown off of a giant rock. And then he tried to establish someone else, and he also lost. Now, the interesting thing is that this enemy of Menas had allied with both the Ottomans and the Portuguese in order to conquer Menes, but Menes was able to destroy them both, which is why on the king's list, the next king is Sarsadengo, another warrior that would fight directly against the Ottomans. These are the Ottoman ships that would land in the African East Coast areas and would be used to fight against the Portuguese in their strangest and strongest holds. It became pretty obvious to both the Portuguese and the Ottomans that control of this region could not be done without the help of both foreign powers and native powers. And so Mir Ali Beg used the people, didn't use them, but applied the people inside the region for help, first in Mombasa requesting ships and weapons. And in Mombasa, they were able to take over the fort and create their own fort, which today is known as Fort Jesus. This fort, over the years, would go back and forth between the Portuguese and the Ottoman powers, holding it one to another. Now, remember, they weren't holding it themselves, they were holding it through the vassals or the statesmen of these native lands, which made it a very complicated thing for everyone involved. What made it truly a world war is that Mir Ali Beg was fighting on the behalf of the Ottomans, and the Ottomans at this point were destroying lands far and wide, and the Portuguese were doing the same. As these people, Mir Ali Beg, were being attacked by the Portuguese who had deep influence in Goa. But here's the problem. The Ottomans also had deep influence in India. If you remember, the people, the Ottomans, were trying to take over parts of Persia, but Persia, of course, was holding its own. And of course, the Ottomans were cunning as well as fierce, and so they decided to side with a group inside of India, the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire became a very good partner of the Ottomans. But let us return to the issue at hand. Mir Ali Beg decided that his main concern was the Swahili coast, and that is the area that he decided to protect. But he realized that he needed allies, and so he used the people of Mombasa. But not only that, he decided that another group that he needed to aid his population were the people of Mogadishu. The people of Mogadishu, being Muslim, also aided Mir Ali Beg. Mir Ali Beg, Mombasa, and the Ottomans became sworn enemies in a single century. Now, this century would prove a couple different things, as the Adil Sultanate would transform into a different sultanate, the Ajuran Sultanate. It became pretty obvious that the Portuguese were not wanted, as these are the names of the allies of the Ottomans who were fighting against the Portuguese. Now, if you notice, there are some areas that are mentioned inside of the areas. So at the top, we have the Portuguese areas which they colonized, and then on the side, we have the areas that now are siding with the Ottomans in order to get rid of the Portuguese. Similar names would be Pemba, as you notice at the top of the list on the side, Pemba, and at the bottom of the Portuguese hold, Pemba. Also, you'll notice that Mombasa is in there. And of course, the other places like Kilwa were not satisfied with the invasion of the Portuguese either. And they, again, would fight back and forth between these lands for years to come for supremacy over these regions. The only one of these lands that would actually and actively be engaged in the war versus the Ottomans is Malindi, and Malindi had a good force to it. But remember, Kilwa had always been a very small occupation, meaning, and also it was an island, so it was very difficult for it to help in very troubled times. The Mozambique island, of course, is more of a trading post than it is a fighting area. And so the Ottomans basically defeated the Portuguese. But of course, this wouldn't last long as the Portuguese had a hold in Goa, India, and they had a hold in Portugal and the Cape of Good Hope, and had some growing regions in Angola and Congo. So truly, they were not going anywhere, not anytime soon. But the Portuguese were not stupid either. This would also have some consequences when it comes to this Ottoman leader ruling in these regions. So, what were the consequences? Well, there was a group called the Zimba, and the Zimba wanted to cross a area which was fortified by the Ottomans. And these Zimba who wanted to cross this region found themselves stuck between the Ottomans and where they were trying to go. And so the Zimba decided that they were going to fight against these Ottomans. In a weird twist of fate, the Ottomans were captured by the Portuguese because of this distraction. And when they were captured, they basically lost all the holdings in these regions. The Mwenimui of Malindi was rewarded greatly for his work against the Ottomans, and it became pretty obvious to the Ottomans that complete subjugation was not going to be an option in these regions. Instead, what they needed was to work with the natives in order to fight against anyone who would come in. And of course, nobody would let them just rule this area uninterrupted. Which brings me to the Moravi Kingdom. The Moravi Kingdom was growing steadily since the 1500s, and in the 1600s it had grown more than any other kingdom in that area. And even you can see here that the Portuguese only had prazos, which prazos are not exactly great standings or great holdings in these areas. Well, how big was this Malawi area? Well, it's not the same size as Malawi is today. In fact, it was huge. It occupied Zambia, Mozambique, and what is today Malawi. Now, in order to understand what prazos means, we have to look into the areas in which the prazos were situated. And as you can see here as we read, the distribution of African societies under the impact of Western advances is a familiar story. Less well known are those exceptions when African people broke down European institutions. In the Zambezi Valley, significant Africanization occurred during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Prazo system was intended as a ambitious colonization scheme, but lost its European identity. In fact, so completely were the Portuguese prazos transformed that the descendants of the early settlers fought Lisbon's encroachment of a later period. The most extensive study made to date concerning the Portuguese Prazos da Caria or Crown Estates is Alan F. Iskerman, Mozambican Africanization Institution. Prazos have been described variously as a transplanted Portuguese feudal institution, an altered plantation scheme, and an Arabic system. Isaacman is at odds with all of these interpretations, and he offers a much more sophisticated and complex explanation based on the weaving of oral data and written documents. The Prazaras did not remove the existing African authorities, but imposed a new political institution on top of the indigenous order. Yet the Prazo holder relied on the traditional leadership for recognition and specific. Gradually, the European system evolved into a unique institution. Not very surprisingly, those Prazos who most completely adopted African customs enjoyed the greatest status. This acculturation, Isaacman points out, tended to obscure the difference between African subjects and alien overlords. Now, this happened, of course, because of this history that has happened at the same time, where it became obvious that you could not rule without the help of the natives in that region. And so they wanted to do what they did in Madagascar and several other states in the world, which is to put in native rulers who have the Portuguese's thoughts in mind or best wishes in mind. Like they point out here, this had good and bad things happening at the same time, as a lot of these prazos, when it came to decolonization, would fight against the Portuguese because, of course, they identified themselves with the local population. But also, it meant that in their favor, the Maravi people did not see the Portuguese areas as foreign areas, but instead looked at them as just another kingdom or other locations located in the native area controlled by native people, and this facilitated trade between the two areas. The Portuguese did have thoughts of colonizing the Maravi kingdom, but the Maravi kingdom fought back viciously, and it turned out that they couldn't do anything to them until the 19th century. Prior to the Berlin Conference, the Portuguese had started realizing that colonization, especially their dream of connecting a colonized Kingdom of Congo with a colonized Swahili coast, was becoming impossible slowly. They just decided to give up their dream, but instead trade heavily. And this Maravi kingdom, which they had some fights with the Portuguese, but the Portuguese just gave up completely and decided to have a trade war with these people, shows how the natives were completely in control of this area, which couldn't be said about some areas further south. As we read, this article seeks to re-examine the contemporary evidence about the early history of the Moravi chieftaincies, or northern Zambezia. It challenges the view that the Moravi were long established in Zambezia and became aggressive and expansionist in the late 16th century when the Portuguese interfered with the ivory trade. Instead, it suggests that these chieftains were only formed in the second half of the 16th and first half of the 17th century by a number of different groups who migrated into the region north of the Zambezi and who conquered the existing populations. Some of these intrusive groups crossed the Zambezi and attacked the wealthier Karanga states to the south, but these invasions were frustrated by the Portuguese, who blocked all attempts to settle south of the river. Defeated in their efforts, the Moravi chiefs turned aside to invade the Mozambique lowlands. It was one of these incursions that in the 1580s, it was one of these incursions that the 1580s gave rise to the legend of the marauding cannibal Zimba. The establishment of settled Maravi states occurred only as a result of the rise of the Muzura in the first half of the 17th century. He defeated his rivals with Portuguese aid. but was in turn frustrated in his attempts to interfere in Karangaland, and in the end was badly defeated by the Portuguese in 1632. Thereafter, he concentrated his activity on developing the ivory trade with the Portuguese on the Zambezi and Mozambique island, while the region south of the Zambezi became subject to the Portuguese warlords and the trade monopoly of the captain of Mozambique. As we can see, in these times, these regions were still being held by natives. As you can see there, Mozambique belongs to the Moravi Kingdom. We can see most of the areas of the Moravi Kingdom. And of course, now the Portuguese are heading inland a little bit. And just above them, what you can see is a place called Yao. This area, called Yao, was controlled by a group of people who traded heavily with Arabs. With growing Muslim influence, the Yao would form a sultanate area, which we'll talk about another day, which would dominate this region, fighting against the British, the Portuguese, and every other colonizer, would-be colonizer. While bravely fighting against all these kingdoms and withstanding all of them, they would have never imagined the people who would take them out. The Yao people would find themselves in conflict with the Moravi people in the 18th century. But it wouldn't be because of the Portuguese, and it wouldn't be because of the British or anybody else like that. Instead, it was a group far, far south. A young king was born named Shaka Zulu. His life would transform the entire East Coast region of Africa, starting off with the Portuguese. His forefathers would have made contact with the people in the coast, in the Swahili coast. In fact, these people not only had trade with these people, but instead called some of them to use their battle strategies in war. These strategies would eventually help Shaka Zulu become the most fierce ruler ever. Something that is underestimated about this is the fact that the Zulu kingdom was a breakaway from another kingdom. And this tradition of breaking away would happen over and over again. Shaka Zulu's grandfather, Jama, had great hopes for his kingdom. But someone that he never realized had greater hopes was his daughter, Mkabayi, who aided Shaka Zulu in his wars, being an advisor both in conflict and in the royal standings. In terms of weapons, the Zulu people were no better than almost anyone in the region, with the exception of the introduced short spear by Shaka Zulu. But the key person who played a role was Mkabayi, who one by one would pick apart certain nations that Shaka Zulu attacked. Her nature was cunning, and she must have passed it down to her other nephews because they picked it up when they were going to the areas of Malawi. But before that would happen, Shaka Zulu would go crazy and implement laws in his nation that his own people could not withstand. Mkabayi, caring more about her own nations than Shaka Zulu, decided to destroy Shaka Zulu and have him assassinated by his own brothers. The number of people who escaped during Shaka Zulu's terrible reign is so numerous that it is possible that they were getting this at the order of Mkabayi. For example, the Mzilikazi guy who went to Zimbabwe, and then there's the Ndebele people, and then there's the Mfengu as well. These are several tribes that left. In 1815, there was one more tribe that left, and this tribe would clash with the Maravi. After surviving the Portuguese, the Arabs, and other clans that would try to take over Malawi, they did not fall to a sophisticated tribe. They did not fall to a well bombarded area, and they did not fall to a fortified nation. Instead, they fell to a clan that had no choice but to move further north, the Ngoni people. The Ngoni people are clear in their culture that they are Zulu. These people, the Moravi who had moved south over and over again, found themselves in a difficult position because the people who were Ngoni, who had taken over, were not the only clan that had moved north. Mzilikazi, who had moved to Zimbabwe, had first tried to move to Mozambique and was defeated, leaving tribes that were on guard. And so in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and basically every region nearby to the south, everybody was on guard and was not open to new clans moving in. And so the Moravi moved north to the Yayo area where they found a new home. But just like every other civilization, you cannot do without the natives. And so there are many natives of the Moravi who stayed, whose culture was altered in the same way, just like the Mozambique or the people of Mzilikazi who were civilized by the Zimbabweans they met, creating their own version of stone structures. This period in history puts a weird block when it comes to studying the languages of these areas. As you can see, there must have been a very large amount of trade in words between all of these areas. And we can count them lastly before I end the video. The people of Congo who moved east, the people of the north who moved south in order to help form the Moravi Kingdom, the Zulu people who moved north, the Mozambican people who were moving up and down the coast, the Arabs, and the Portuguese. How exactly do you find the words and writings of these people and be able to separate them one from the other? That's a story for another day. Like, share, subscribe for an even deeper look into these kingdoms as I have skimmed over all of their histories.